Okay, well, that was surprisingly easy. First time recording. All right, guys. Well, welcome. This is the fifth installment of the cybersecurity workshop at Toro. Today we'll be talking about vulnerability assessments. What's this? My name is Michael Seifert. We'll be talking for about 40 to 45 minutes on vulnerability assessments today, and typically, I allocate 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. So questions are welcome. I'll always encourage you, though, since I'm interrupt driven, I say, to raise your hand and ask questions during the talk itself. It's just I've yet to quite find the sweet spot where I can both have the presentation in full screen mode and see the chat. So I'm going to try to thread that needle again. Let's see here. Let's see if I can pull up the chat. Well, unfortunately, I'm not sure I can see the chat right now. Well, hold on, there we go. Okay, there we go. Got the chat window up, and in theory, I should see any questions as they come up. So feel free to enter them in there, and I'll do my best to address them as they come up. So, okay, cool. All right, let's get into it. Real quick, you've seen this a couple times, but for those of you it's your first time, again, my name is Michael Seifert. I'm a cybersecurity researcher by day. I develop code as well. So I write programs, I write applications. I enjoy software reverse engineering. I like getting software somebody else has written, scrutinizing it, analyzing it, figuring out how it works, how I can break it, or make it do what I want, that sort of thing. I teach a couple courses here at Toro. Most recently statistics, and cybersecurity is going to be an upcoming one, I believe. A little disclaimer on the bottom: views I express are my own, not of any of my employers, of course. All right, so what are we talking about today? Well, the title has it: vulnerability assessments. What is that at a really high level? It's scanning for and finding out where our systems and our networks that have those systems are vulnerable, where the software running has issues that's potentially exploitable by an attacker or someone with bad motives. So we'll cover what they are, why they're useful, what they teach us as cybersecurity practitioners, what we do with the information, some of the limitations to vulnerability assessment and the tools, the scanning tools themselves. So we cover a couple of tools. I have one video where we get to see, I believe, OpenVAS, an open source vulnerability scanner in action. I didn't actually make it. It's the first one I'll pull up on YouTube, and we'll see that in action for a moment. Some related topics that we touch on that are very closely related to vulnerability assessment. One is software vulnerabilities. I'm not sure everyone will have been exposed to that at this point. We talk about what sort of leads to a software vulnerability. What are the different types? What are the different ramifications? That sort of thing. Another interest, dear to my heart is sort of finding vulnerabilities. So I list some of the processes, some of the tools, some of the techniques researchers and actors use to find them. I do have a slide on mitigations. What do we do in response to them? Typically, it's pretty simple. We want to get rid of the vulnerabilities, right? We want to have no vulnerabilities on our network. And then we touch briefly on some real world considerations. What sort of things come up when these things are happening in the real world. Okay, so I mentioned probably a couple of terms here. Vulnerability assessment, I'll typically be saying vulnerability scan. A lot of times when we're assessing vulnerability, we're scanning for vulnerabilities on our network. Again, vulnerabilities are those things that let attackers come in. We want to minimize whenever possible. So definitely hit on software vulnerabilities. CVE is a term I'm hoping several of you have heard of, but if not, you will have after today. Since for common vulnerabilities and exposures, it's how we identify vulnerabilities out there in the wild. CVSS score is how we rate vulnerabilities as far as like how much damage they can cause, how difficult they are to exploit, that sort of a thing. It gives us like that high, medium, low sort of reading. How much do we care about this vulnerability? Another interesting topic is we'll touch on responsible disclosure. It's sort of this notion of acting responsibly when you find a vulnerability that's out there on software that's running somewhere in the world. Banner grabbing is something that's typical for vulnerability scanners to use. So we'll touch on all these things. All right, so why do we assess vulnerabilities? Why do we scan for vulnerabilities? Why do we want to know what's out there? Well, vulnerabilities can be exploited by attackers, and I say there to pwn. That's sort of the hacker term for owning or controlling, or otherwise making systems that aren't your own do your bidding, essentially, right? So when you hear an attacker say they pwned this system or that network, it means they've exploited a vulnerability and installed some code, and they now control those systems in some regard. I mean, maybe it's a little bit of control, maybe it's a lot, but that's what we're sort of we don't want to happen as defenders and as researchers, right? We want to keep the attackers out and keep them from pwning us or owning us. So I'll note that not all vulnerabilities are exploitable, but they're never good, right? It's always leads to some sort of negative outcome, whether that's something that can be crashed or it can expose information, that sort of thing. Denial of service. We'll cover the different types of vulnerabilities here in a slide or two. So I think it's probably pretty clear at this point, but since these vulnerabilities each have the possibility of being the door that the attacker walks through, we really want to know where they are on our networks, and that gives us the knowledge we need to go ahead and patch those systems. Patch meaning upgrade or apply the security updates to those systems, to hopefully newer versions of the software that hopefully is without those vulnerabilities, right? That's the goal, is to get all our software up to date and keep it up to date, and do so before attackers can exploit them. So I say on the bottom here, finding and patching, exploiting those vulnerabilities is often a race between attacker and defender, and that's true. Basically, they're both sides, red team and blue team, offense and defense. They're constantly churning, looking for vulnerabilities. The bad guys, the attackers, the red team, they want to find them so that they can get in, right? And the blue team wants to find them so they can patch them, so they can fix the software, upgrade it, do those sorts of things and protect the system. And this really is a race. There's people on both sides of the fence working every day to uncover vulnerabilities and to exploit them. So what sort of leads to vulnerabilities? Well, it's almost always that someone's written software in such a way that it has a flaw. For those of you on the call that have actually done any development or programming or coding or whatever you like to call it, it's challenging. It's especially challenging to write code that can't be taken advantage in some way. If you're like me, you can crank out programs relatively quickly, but you're not typically thinking of them being abused or someone giving your program input that's malformed or unexpected in some way. Now, it turns out that developers introduce a very predictable rate of bugs and flaws in software. Current estimates put it somewhere between 1 and 25 bugs or flaws per 1,000 lines of code. And just to give you an idea, the Chrome browser, last time I checked, has about 35 million lines of code. If you say, well, they're on the low end of that, they only create 5 bugs per 1,000. If I've done my math right, that means there's about 175,000 bugs in Chrome. Now, granted, they're working around the clock to bring that number down, right? So there's a good chance it's maybe less than that. But the point is, with any significant, with applications of any significant size, there's virtually guaranteed to be some kind of flaw or vulnerability in that code. I believe one of the exceptions or one of the standouts was 50, 60 years ago, the Apollo program. I think I'm pretty confident saying like that the cell phone we all use is more powerful than all the computers they had in the Apollo program. But because they were working with such stringent constraints and limitations on the resources, things like CPU, memory, that sort of a thing, they really iterated over the code and got that bug rate way down. So it might have been, and I'm probably going to be off here, but maybe one bug every 10 or 20,000 lines of code instead of this sort of rate there. You can imagine there was a lot more on the line. They were really looking at every line of code, doing what they could. So a lot of these bugs can have disastrous effects if an attacker can trigger them. If the bad guy can exploit it, it's bad news. And for the developers out there, those of you who have written code, I just give 2 quick examples of mistakes that can lead to vulnerability. There was a famous one in the Linux kernel several years ago, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, where somebody submitted some code that had this instead of this. And if you've written code, you're going to be able to spot the difference. the code should have read like this, which says, if the user ID is equal to 0, then do one thing or the other. So this is just checking whether or not user ID is 0. And on Linux, if you have user ID 0, that means you're root, or you have the highest privilege level on that box. Instead, what was submitted was this snippet of code, which actually assigns 0 to user ID. So this makes the user, whoever it was, now root, or now the administrator of that box. So I didn't follow too closely, but there was rumors that potentially this was actually inserted on purpose to insert a vulnerability. I'm not sure of that, but in any case, one equal sign here really made all the difference in the world between code the function as it should and vulnerable code. Here's another one where system is a call on Linux to execute a command, and in this case we're reading from a socket into a buffer, and then we're just executing that. And this is okay if you get only benign commands, but you might get something like a netcat command. If you recall, I think it was last week we covered netcat. Netcat can be used to do all sorts of cool things for an attacker. So things like that can lead to a vulnerability. This is now network vulnerabilities. So basically, the discussion we just had about software vulnerabilities, they become a lot more important when that code or when that application is accessible on the network. And the top bullet here, basically, a large portion of the vulnerabilities out there basically involve consuming user input one way or the other. And that's why attackers can typically have the effects they want, because they can provide some data to an application, and that application makes a mistake in parsing or consuming that data that we're giving it. And that's where a vulnerability can sort of be shown. So just examples of parsing user input. Whenever you launch Microsoft Word and you give it let's say a docx file, that's input. So Word is processing that file. And there have been over the years many vulnerabilities in Office products like Word, where you could give it a malformed or a malicious docx file in this case, and actually exploit Microsoft Word as it's parsing, as it's reading it off the disk. So when you're speaking into a speech recognition capability, you're providing input. That's the key. If software is consuming user input, that's a very rich source of vulnerabilities in our applications out there. And of course, web servers, every time you go to a website, your browser is giving some input to the web server. So that web server really has to be secure, it has to be coded well to not have these flaws. So again, when software is running and it's exposed to the network, well, the network goes all around the globe. I can send a packet from here to the other side of the globe. So whereas if it's a GUI, if it's a graphical application, something like Notepad or calculator, that's not likely to be exploited because it's not on the network. But if I have a application that listens on the network, all of a sudden I'm susceptible to those attack packets from around the world or wherever the attackers are. And yeah, that's what I covered here on the last bullet. So some high-level categories of vulnerabilities or their criticality, starting with the most salient or the most critical one is remote code execution or RCE vulnerabilities. These are sort of the worst. These are that nightmare situation where somebody from wherever they are on the network can send traffic to our application and actually execute code. And once they're executing code, it's essentially equivalent to them being a user on that computer. Now, they may be an unprivileged user, but as we see in the next type, there are also privilege escalation vulnerabilities that allow an unprivileged user to elevate and become what they call as root, or an administrator. It's the equivalent of an administrator on a machine. So a lot of times attackers will pair these things. They'll find a remote code execution vulnerability that gets them code execution somewhere, even if it's unprivileged. And then they'll find or use a privilege escalation vulnerability they know of to become root, become administrator. Another class is denial of service vulnerability. These vulnerabilities typically can't be exploited. An attacker can't run code, but if he sends input that's formatted just the right way, he can cause your application to, let's say, crash. So denial of service just means you're not able to use that application, or it's not able to fulfill its normal role. And you'll recall when we covered, I think, in the cybersecurity tools talk, we discussed a couple of denial of service tools. It's sort of similar in that you're finding some way to stop software from running. So how do we find these software vulnerabilities sort of early in the process? I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially there's, the whole goal is to find them as developers are writing the code. You want to find them all during that phase rather than after you've published code and thousands or millions of people are using it around the world. That's not when you want to find out there's a vulnerability in your code. Turns out there's this whole practice called DevSecOps that one of its main goals is to crank out secure code. So it's lots of processes and procedures for, creating code that ends, is as free from vulnerabilities as possible. So some of the things that are useful are code reviews. If I write the code, it's helpful if the guy down the hall or somebody that knows about secure programming to review my code and let me know if he sees anything, right? Another cool area is software fuzzing. And basically that involves getting an application that you're testing and you give it lots of input and you just give it random or bad, intentionally bad input just to make sure that it can handle them. And, one sort of an example my buddies and I like to toss around is if the application says, how many beers would you like? Well, typically the person who made it and normal users are going to answer things like 0 or 2 or 5 or, just give it a number. But that application has to be able to handle the case where somebody actually says, I'll take -1 beers, please, or purple, right? So that if the application isn't written correctly, it might fail on some of those inputs and needs to be able to what we call sanitize the input and make sure that there's nothing that's going to cause it to, do anything it shouldn't. Another interesting area I'd love to do a talk on is symbolic and cacolic execution. It turns out software execution looks a lot like this tree over here, where there's lots of decision points and it splits. Symbolic and cacolic execution sort of involve crafting input that ensures that you can get down every single path. So not just, this path, but all these paths down here. It's going to make sure that it can test every single branch that a piece of software takes or a piece of code takes in order to sort of eliminate the possibility that there are vulnerabilities in there. So responsible disclosure, a topic that interests me as well, related to vulnerabilities and finding them. This term refers to it's this notion that if you have found a vulnerability in a deployed software application, let's say Microsoft Word, that you should handle that sort of responsibly. That it would be irresponsible for you, again, to have person who just found a vulnerability in Word, to just tweet it and say, hey, look, there's a vulnerability, and if you craft a Microsoft Word file in this way, it'll give you execution on any machine that opens it. Because as soon as you do that, certainly attackers and the bad guys, red teamers, they're going to pounce on that information and they're going to start crafting files that have that form and using them to exploit, systems all of the planet, right? And in that case, you haven't given Microsoft, the vendor in this case, an opportunity to fix the product before everybody knows about it. So that's the general idea behind responsible disclosure, is that if I find a vulnerability, I want to give the vendor an opportunity to fix the vulnerability and to release an update before I tell people about it, and so the bad guys can start using it. And just said this earlier, but it should be pretty obvious to anyone who's been listening to these lectures so far that exploiting vulnerabilities can lead to real harm. Certainly, personal information can be stolen. Businesses can lose money or productivity. In the case of cyber physical systems, or systems that have some real world component to them, think planes or radars or robots that are in factories, anything that touches the real world in some way. Physical harm can result in exploitation of those systems. So again, I won't spend too much time on it, but the idea is, if I found a vulnerability, I discreetly notify the vendor, and typically I'll work with them on some timetable. Like, hey, I'm a researcher. I want to present this at a talk because I find the topic interesting. This vulnerability that I found. So I plan on doing that in 6 weeks. Can you have a fix out in 6 weeks time frame, so that when I post about it, it's not going to be free reign for attackers and the bad guys to go ahead and weaponize that information. So that's the idea with responsible disclosure. The other side of that coin is that there's there's a market for vulnerabilities. So if I find a vulnerability, and again, let's for a moment assume it's the worst case scenario where it's a remote code execution where I can just fire a packet or traffic at any machine running a particular piece of software and exploit it. Well, somebody will pay you for that. I won't get into the sums, but they can be quite large. So I'm not saying one way is right, one way is wrong, but those are the two notions related to responsible disclosure. Okay, so CVEs, I mentioned this earlier. It stands for common vulnerabilities and exposure, but nobody really ever uses the full term. It's just CVE, and what it is an identifier, a unique identifier for any vulnerability that someone finds in published code. So here's a CVE ID right here. The format's pretty simple. It starts with CVE, then the year the vulnerability was discovered, followed by the number. So this turns out this CVE was the 144th vulnerability documented in the year 2017. Just before this talk, I checked where we are right now as far as 2021. I think we're in the 20,000s. So, as we get better and better at finding vulnerabilities in code, more and more of these are created. So I suspect every year there's more CVEs than there were the previous year, but we're already way up there. So CVEs will, contain typically a description of the flaw. It'll include a severity rating. Again, like how critical is this? Is it the kind of thing that can only be exploited by a person sitting at the box? It's already an administrator. Okay, well, if so, then it's not a huge deal. But if it's a remote code execution and it can be fired from around the globe with somebody that's unauthenticated, then it's going to be likely a high severity rating. So we'll talk about that scoring in a slide or two. It'll talk about the affected software packages. So it'll say, this vulnerability affects this exact version of the software with its version number and everything. It'll reference public discussion and things where people are discussing ramifications of the vulnerability or its inner workings, that sort of thing. And I'm not positive on this one, last one, but I was pretty sure it was the case when I wrote the slide, which is I believe it will typically reference the person or organization that discovered the flaw as well. Because some people, that's how they make their living is discovering vulnerabilities and getting recognition for it one way or the other. I guess on the last slide, I mentioned CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. So this is how we rate the severity of vulnerabilities that are found out there. So it ends up producing a number between 0 and 10. There have been a couple different iterations of CVSS. I believe the current version is 3.1. So this graphic on the left gives you an idea of what we're talking about, the different elements of that score. So each one of these boxes is a different attribute of a vulnerability. So this first one is attack vector. So the worst one in this case is network, meaning that all the attacker has to have is the ability to send network traffic to software to exploit it. Next is he's on a network adjacent to the one where the software is running. Local means an attacker has to have execution already on the host to exploit the software. And then physical access means the attacker actually has to be physically, in possession of the machine he's gonna exploit. So typically, that's the largest assumption for an attacker. He wants every vulnerability to be this, so that he can just exploit it from the network. Other elements are like how complex rather is the attack that needs to be mounted to exploit it, right? So attackers want the attack complexity to be low. As defenders, we want it to be really complex. If we know that it have to be Albert Einstein to craft an exploit, to attack our software, we'd rather that than anybody can do it. How much privileges are required beforehand to launch it? Does it require user interaction or not? An attacker wants there to be no user interaction. And if a human doing something is required, that's a downside for an attacker, a good thing for defenders. CIA, you guys may have heard of the CIA triad. It stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So what kind of effects will this have on the system? Confidentiality refers to the ability to keep things secret that we don't want everybody to know. So if something reduces confidentiality, things like encryption might be lost, or we might lose control of certain data we have. Integrity means an attacker can affect data. He can change valid data to be invalid, and the users might not know it. That's what integrity is. Availability is sort of associated with like a denial of service. So Availability means will the service still be able to be available in performing its normal function if it's attacked? So down here is a little descriptor of how these will typically be described. So one CVSS might be rated as medium with a resulting score of 5-1. And right here, AV:A, that means the attack vector, the attacker has to be adjacent. AC:H, the attack complexity is high, etc. That's how we rate vulnerabilities. CPE, we'll go quickly through this, but basically a CPE is a unique identifier for each version of published software. So, there have been probably 500 different versions of Microsoft Word released over the years. And I don't mean 500 different versions, marketed to people. It's probably been 5 of those, but each one, there's often updates to software that you buy where the version number actually gets incremented. So we want to be able to, uniquely identify software when, let's say, version 3.572 has a vulnerability, but the previous version 3.571 and the version afterwards 3.573 do not. You want to be able to in the CVE say this vulnerability affects version 3.572 of a specific package. So down here we see some CPE information for Adobe Connect. Something you can look into more if you're interested. Okay, so getting on to the tools, vulnerability scanning tools. There's several general purpose scanners out there. One I have most exposure to is an open source one called OpenVAS. Nessus was formerly open source, but now it's a commercial solution, and there are several of these tools out there. I'll quickly link to a video where someone on YouTube is using the OpenVAS. It maybe have been renamed to Greenbone, actually, the scanner, just so you can get an idea what the interface looks like. There are also sort of specialized vulnerability scanning or assessment tools out there. Since web is so big and web applications are really growing in popularity, there are scanners that focus just on web applications, and they wouldn't be, let's say, applicable to things like an FTP server or a name server, that sort of a thing. So Nikto is one of them. And you see the quote here. I pulled this from their website yesterday. It scans up for 6,700 dangerous files and programs on websites, outdated versions of over 1,000 different servers, and other misconfigurations that can occur. So the process is typically pretty simple. You fire up your vulnerability scanner. You tell it which systems you want to scan. So I want to scan, IP address 10.10.1.3 and 10.10.1.5. Oftentimes they'll have a, well, I think OpenVAS calls it how deep of a scan do you want, but how thorough do you want the scan to take? So if there's high, medium, and low, the high or the really deep scan will typically take a lot longer than the low depth scan, if you will. So that'll sort of depend on how much time you have. You hit go, you let the automated tool do its thing. It's gonna do its check. You wait for it to finish, and you process its results. Real quick, I see a question before I play the video. As a programmer, if I create software on my local hard disk, do hackers have access to that software before I even compile to create an exe? So no is the answer. Nope. If it's on your local hard drive, unless your computer has been previously exploited by an attacker, and unbeknownst to you, he has some code running on your machine that that allows him to pull files and such. Nope. It's all local until you push it somewhere. Until you have given that code to someone and you tell them to run it on their machine, in which case it might be accessible to, they might be exposed to the internet or not. That's when it sort of becomes an issue. But so the short answer is no. Good question. So I didn't make this video. There's an audio track. I don't know if the audio is going to come through. I'll play it and we'll sort of see how this goes. But you can chime in if the audio isn't coming through, and maybe I can do a little audio track to it. So it's in the middle of this video. This user has essentially